The fire took my restoration studio in under an hour. My mother took 10 seconds to decide it wasn't her problem, standing in the ash-choked lot. I listened to Cynthia sigh into the phone. "That's terrible, Caroline," she said. "But honestly, you should have been more careful." Then, the fire investigator walked up. He didn't offer pity. He held out an evidence bag containing a melted brass keychain. He asked exactly who had access to my building last week, because what happened wasn't an accident. And looking at that keychain, I already knew the answer. Corey did not offer me pity. He offered me a notepad and a quiet, steady gaze. He asked if I had enemies. I told him I restored 18th century oil paintings and appraised historical estates for a living. The art world has rivalries, but rarely arson. He wrote that down. Then he gestured toward the far corner of the burned studio, the place where my heavy metal filing cabinet used to stand. The heat pattern there was different. Someone had poured an accelerant right against the base of it. My hands were perfectly still. That surprised me a little. You spend your whole life waiting for the moment your family finally goes too far, and when it arrives, it doesn't look like panic. It looks like an answered question. Corey asked who had access to the building this week. I looked at the melted brass keychain in his evidence bag. 2 years ago, I bought that keychain at a coastal gift shop. I gave it to Vanessa for Christmas. She used it for the spare studio key she asked for last month, claiming she needed a quiet place to take real estate client calls. I gave him Vanessa's full name. I gave him her address, her phone number, and the make of her luxury car. He asked if there was any reason my sister would want to burn my business to the ground. I thought about the Oakwood estate. I thought about the acres of land, the antebellum architecture, and the 72-year-old gardener named Harold who lived in the cottage out back. Just last week, Harold had called me, his voice trembling. He said Vanessa had stopped by with 2 men in sharp suits. They pointed at his cottage, and Vanessa laughed, saying something about clearing the dead weight. If Vanessa got control of Oakwood, Harold would be out on the street before the month ended. He had no pension, just a life estate promise from Gloria that Vanessa wanted to erase. I was not going to let that happen. Corey watched my face carefully. He told me that cases involving family get complicated fast, and that people usually want to withdraw their statements when the reality of prison time sets in. I looked back at the smouldering remains of my livelihood, years of painstaking restoration work, gone in smoke. I told him I did not withdraw statements. I only dealt in permanent records. I asked him what the next steps were. He advised me to find a hotel and get some sleep. I nodded, though sleep was out of the question. I walked to my car, brushing soot from my coat. I did not call Cynthia back. I did not call Douglas. I sat in the driver's seat and watched the fire trucks roll their hoses. The police were just starting their work. Mine had already begun. I put the car in drive. I didn't look back. Chapter 2. 504 words. To understand why Vanessa needed a fire, you have to understand what I do for a living. I am an estate appraiser and an art restorer. People hire me to look at things they assume are worthless and find the hidden value. I spend my days removing layers of dirt, grime, and cheap overpaint to reveal the original masterpiece underneath. My job requires patience, a quiet room, and a relentless commitment to documentation. Every brushstroke I make is logged. Every chemical solvent I use is recorded. I do not trust memory. I trust ledgers. My family always hated that about me. Cynthia used to call it an obsession with the past. Douglas called it nitpicking. Vanessa just rolled her eyes and called me a glorified librarian. But my habits were not born out of a love for old things. They were born out of a need to protect myself. When you grow up in a house where the truth changes, depending on what Vanessa wants, you learn to keep receipts, a week before the fire. I noticed a subtle shift in my studio. The third drawer of my filing cabinet, the one labelled Oakwood Estate Preliminary Appraisals, was closed, but not latched. I never leave it unlatched. A few files inside were slightly out of order. Someone had been searching for the ownership deed and the inheritance documents. They were looking for the legal heart of Gloria's estate. Vanessa was drowning in debt. I knew it, even if Cynthia and Douglas pretended not to. Vanessa drove a leased SUV, wore designer clothes, and threw lavish open house parties for properties she never managed to sell. She lived on borrowed money and borrowed time. And Oakwood was the largest unliquidated asset in our family. It was worth $850,000, not counting the art inside. If she could force the sale of the estate, her debts would vanish. But she needed the original documents to do that. She needed the deed, and she needed the will. She assumed I kept them in that heavy metal filing cabinet at the studio. That was her first mistake. Art restorers know that the surface is often a lie. You never keep your most valuable assets where everyone can see them. I operated on a strict 3-copy rule. 1 paper copy in a fireproof bank safe, 1 digital copy on an encrypted cloud server, and 1 working copy for daily use. The files in that drawer were nothing more than working copies. Useless paper. But Vanessa did not know that. She saw a cabinet full of legal jargon and assumed she had struck gold. She thought she could burn the past and rewrite the future. The studio smelled of chemicals and old paper, making it the perfect kindling. She probably thought it would look like an accident, a tragic chemical spill. She underestimated the investigator, and she vastly underestimated her sister. I drove toward the only place that made sense at 3 a.m. I drove toward Oakwood. The iron gates were locked. The morning after the fire, I met Corey back at the studio ruins. The sunlight made the destruction look even more violent. Charred beams jutted into the sky like broken ribs. Water from the fire hoses pooled in the low spots of the concrete floor, dark with soot. Corey walked me through the safety perimeter. We wore hard hats and thick boots. He wanted me to identify any surviving items for the insurance report. We stepped carefully over the debris of my workbenches. I guided him toward the far wall, away from the filing cabinet that Vanessa had targeted. Underneath a collapsed section of drywall, there was a stack of metal frames. They were blackened and warped by the heat. I asked Corey if he could pull the bottom frame out. He grunted, using a pry bar to lift the heavy debris, and dragged the frame into the light. It was an antique brass structure I had been restoring for a client. The glass was shattered, and the canvas was nothing but ash. But that was not what I was looking for. I knelt in the soot and ran my gloved fingers along the thick, hollow backing of the frame. I pressed a hidden release catch. The metal panel popped open. Inside, resting in a small, heat-shielded compartment, was a titanium USB drive. It was perfectly intact. Corey stared at it. He asked what it was. I told him it was the real ledger. When I noticed my files had been tampered with last week, I knew someone would come back. I could not stop them from breaking in again. But I could control what they found. I spent 3 nights scanning every original document, every appraisal note, and every legal filing related to Oakwood. I encrypted the drive and hid it inside the frame. Then, I printed a fake document index. I left it right on top of the desk. The fake index explicitly listed the metal filing cabinet as the sole storage location for the Oakwood inheritance papers. I gave Vanessa the map. I pointed her directly toward a pile of useless paper. I let her think she was destroying my leverage. She burned down my business because I handed her the match. Corey looked at me for a long time. The wind rattled a loose piece of siding. He finally asked why I would risk my own studio. I told him you cannot trap a desperate animal without offering it bait. Vanessa needed to believe she had won. If she thought the documents were safe, she would have kept looking. She would have broken into Oakwood. She would have threatened Harold. She would have escalated until someone got hurt. This way, she attacked an empty building. She committed arson for a stack of blank printer paper and outdated tax forms. I slipped the USB drive into my pocket. The metal was cold against my palm. Corey shook his head, a faint trace of respect in his eyes. He said he had never seen anyone lay a trap quite like this. I thanked him for his time. The trap was set. The bait was taken. The jaws had to snap shut. To grasp the audacity of Vanessa's entitlement, you have to look at Cynthia and Douglas. My parents did not build an empire. They built a facade. Douglas was a mid-level bank manager who hated conflict. Cynthia was a social climber who treated the local country club like a royal court. They cared about appearances more than they cared about oxygen. And Vanessa was their perfect reflection. From the time we were children, the rules were split down the middle. Vanessa was the golden child. She was loud, charismatic, and reckless. When she crashed her first car at 19, Douglas quietly paid for the repairs and told me not to mention it to the neighbors. When she dropped out of college and racked up credit card debt, Cynthia liquidated a small retirement fund to clear the balance. They called it supporting her dreams. I was the opposite. I was quiet. I preferred the smell of old varnish to the noise of a party. I paid my own way through art school by working night shifts at a gallery. I never asked them for a dime. Instead of earning their respect, my independence earned their resentment, because I did not need them to fix me. They assumed I did not need them at all. My strength became their excuse to ignore me. Over the years, this dynamic hardened into a cruel kind of normalization. If Vanessa needed money, it was an emergency. If I needed a favor, it was an imposition. I watched them bail her out of failed business ventures and bad investments. They bought into her delusion that she was just one big real estate deal away from becoming a millionaire. They ignored the late notices in her mail. They ignored the aggressive phone calls from private lenders. They normalized her chaos so thoroughly that they could no longer recognize the danger she posed. When I called Cynthia from the burning parking lot, her response wasn't shocking. It was routine, not our problem. You should have been more careful. In Cynthia's mind, if bad things happened to Vanessa, it was the world's fault. If bad things happened to me, it was my own fault. It was a neat, twisted logic that absolved them of any parental responsibility. But normalization has a limit. You can pretend a leak is just a damp spot until the roof caves in. Vanessa's debts had finally outgrown Cynthia and Douglas's ability to cover them. She owed money to people who did not care about country club reputations. She was desperate, and desperate people do not ask for permission. They take I sat in my temporary office space, sipping cold coffee. The realization settled over me, heavy and clear. My parents had trained Vanessa to believe that consequences were for other people. They handed her the matches long before she ever walked into my studio. They built the monster. Now, the monster was hungry. I opened my laptop and plugged in the titanium USB drive. It was time to look at the numbers. It was time to see exactly how deep the rot went. Anger was gone. Only focus remained. I typed in the encryption password. Oakwood is not just a house. It is a timeline written in oak, stone, and ledger entries. 3 years ago, I sat on the wraparound porch with Gloria. She was 81, her posture still rigid, her mind as sharp as a jeweler's lens. We were watching Harold prune the climbing roses near the south brick wall. Harold was 72. He had lived in the small caretaker's cottage at the edge of the property for 4 decades. He knew the chemistry of the soil better than he knew his own name. That afternoon, a lawyer from Atlanta arrived with a thick stack of documents. It was the irrevocable living trust. Gloria did not simply draft a will leaving Oakwood to me. A will can be contested in probate court by angry relatives. Instead, she legally transferred the ownership of the estate out of her personal name and into a trust while she was still alive. She built a legal fortress around the land and named me the sole trustee. The process required an independent witness. The lawyer called Harold up to the porch. Harold carefully wiped the soil from his calloused hands onto his overalls. He looked at the dense, intimidating paragraphs of legal jargon and hesitated. He asked Gloria if she was making the right choice. Gloria looked at the garden, then at me. Caroline is the only one who knows how to protect this place without selling her soul, she said. Harold signed the paper. He didn't understand the tax implications or the asset protection clauses, but he understood the weight of that sentence. Vanessa never understood it. A month later, she visited Oakwood, parking her leased luxury SUV right on the manicured grass. She walked toward the house, her heels sinking into the dirt, and stopped in front of Harold. I was standing just inside the screen door, invisible in the shadows of the hallway. Vanessa crossed her arms and offered a thin, careless smile. "You know, Harold," she said, adjusting her designer sunglasses. "When I sell this place, that cottage is going to be the first thing the bulldozers take down to clear the view. You should really start looking at public retirement homes." Harold did not answer. He just looked at his boots and went back to pruning the thorns. Vanessa treated him like a stray dog trespassing on her future driveway. She viewed Oakwood as an uncashed check. She viewed the people who loved it as minor inconveniences. I did not step out onto the porch to yell at her. Arguing with Vanessa was useless. It only fed her need for drama. Instead, I walked quietly into Gloria's study. I pulled the freshly bound trust documents from the desk. I scanned every page, uploaded the files to an encrypted server, and locked the hard copies in a fireproof safe. Vanessa thought she owned the future because Cynthia and Douglas always gave her what she wanted. She did not know the ink was already dry. The future was already sealed. I just had to wait. Sitting in the temporary office space my insurance agent rented for me, I traced the edge of a soot-stained coffee mug. The smell of smoke still clung to my hair. People often ask why victims of toxic families do not just walk away sooner. They assume it is because we are weak, or because we enjoy the martyrdom. They do not understand the invisible chain of hope. For 34 years, I operated under a silent, desperate assumption. I believed that if I was quiet enough, helpful enough, and successful enough, Cynthia and Douglas would eventually look at me the way they looked at Vanessa. I paid for my own college. I built a respected career in art restoration. I remembered their anniversaries and sent expensive floral arrangements. Every Thanksgiving. I sat at the end of their long dining table, listening to them praise Vanessa's fictional real estate triumphs, waiting for a crumb of validation that never came. This is the trap. You learn to accept scraps and call it a meal. You absorb the subtle insults. You ignore the way your mother changes the subject when you talk about your work. You let them use your independence as an excuse to neglect you. You do it because cutting the tie feels like a failure. It feels like admitting you are unlovable by the two people biologically programmed to love you. I watched the smoke rise from the ruins of my studio the night before, and I finally understood the chain was not made of love. It was made of my own refusal to accept reality. Cynthia did not care that my livelihood was burning. Douglas did not care that I was standing in the cold at 3 a.m. They only cared about how Vanessa's financial mess might reflect on their country club membership. I opened a cardboard box sitting on the temporary desk. The bank had delivered the contents of my safety deposit box via a secure courier that morning. Inside were the backup drives, the original trust documents, and a stack of personal letters from Gloria. I touched the crisp paper of the irrevocable trust. My family had relied on my silence for decades to maintain their comfortable illusion. They expected me to take the hit, rebuild my life from scratch, and let Vanessa walk away clean. That was the old Caroline, the woman who sent flowers and waited for approval. The fire burned that woman away. I sorted the documents into neat, chronological stacks. I aligned the edges perfectly against the table. I did not owe them my patience anymore. I did not owe them my silence. They wanted to play a game with real stakes. I was going to show them the board. I picked up the first letter in Gloria's handwriting. The envelope was cream-coloured, sealed with Gloria's traditional wax stamp. It was addressed to Vanessa, but it lacked a postage mark. Gloria had entrusted it to me, along with the legal files, instructing me to read it only if Vanessa ever tried to break the trust. I broke the wax seal. The handwriting was shaky, dated 6 months before Gloria passed away. I unfolded the thick paper and read the words my grandmother had written in the quiet hours of her life. Kan giathuong, thak makvisaun hung, ngoin hu Vanessa luon jong, vainan han. Homon kauchuyen bigyajin kwailung. Jebian mincho suthamlam kwamin. Nhung to gyai nai kemot kaushuyen khats. Gloria knew about Vanessa's debts. She knew about the missed mortgage payments, the aggressive collection calls, and the shadowy private lenders circling her favourite granddaughter. The letter detailed a wire transfer. Gloria had secretly sent Vanessa $150,000. It was a staggering sum, intended to wipe the slate clean and save Vanessa from bankruptcy. There was only one condition attached to the money. Vanessa had to stop using the Oakwood name to secure risky loans. I read the next paragraph twice. Vanessa took the money. She did not pay off the private lenders. She did not clear her mortgage. Instead, she bought a new Mercedes, threw a lavish networking party at a downtown hotel to attract high-end real estate clients, and booked a first-class trip to Milan. She chose the illusion of wealth over actual salvation. Gloria's final sentences were sharp and steady. I am not cutting you off from my love, Vanessa. I am cutting you off from the ability to destroy everything else I have built. You had your chance. You spent it. I placed the letter carefully inside a clear, plastic sleeve. Vanessa had spent the last 2 years telling the extended family that Gloria was cruel and senile. She claimed she was written out of the inheritance out of sheer spite. She weaponized pity. But here was the undeniable proof. She had been handed a lifeline and used it to buy a luxury car. She wasn't a victim of unfair circumstances. She was the architect of her own ruin. I catalogued the letter in my digital ledger. I scanned the front and the back, ensuring the date and signature were clearly visible. When the time came, Vanessa would try to cry in front of a judge. She would try to paint me as the greedy younger sister who manipulated an old woman. She would try to use tears to wash away facts. I looked at the plastic sleeve. Tears do not erase bank transfers. I closed the file. Finding Gloria's letter was satisfying, but it did not explain the sheer arrogance of Vanessa's arson. Burning my studio was a desperate move. People only take those risks when they are backed into a corner with no other exit. I needed to see exactly who was holding the leash. I logged into a secure public records database and started pulling property liens and loan registries under Vanessa's name. It took me 3 hours of cross-referencing obscure LLCs and private lending firms. Eventually, I found a scanned PDF of a letter of future interest filed 12 months ago. It was a guarantee document used to secure a massive high-interest loan from a private equity firm in Atlanta. Vanessa had listed Oakwood as collateral. Since she did not own Oakwood, the document required a sworn statement from the estate's next of kin confirming her future right to the property. I zoomed in on the bottom of the page. 2 signatures sat neatly on the dotted lines. Cynthia and Douglas. My parents had signed a legal document falsely affirming that Vanessa was the undisputed heir to a property they knew was currently held in trust. They knew she was drowning in debt. They knew she was borrowing money from dangerous people. Instead of stopping her, they enabled the fraud. They put their own signatures on a lie because telling the truth would mean exposing Vanessa's failure to their wealthy friends. They chose their country club reputation over the law. The realization was cold and heavy. They didn't just ignore my boundaries. They actively leveraged my supposed inheritance to keep Vanessa afloat. They assumed I would never find out, or worse, they assumed that if I did find out, I would just stay quiet to protect the family name. They thought my lifelong habit of avoiding conflict was a permanent condition. I saved the PDF. I downloaded the metadata, the timestamps, and the notary stamp details. My mother had stood in a parking lot, smelled the smoke of my burning business, and told me to be more careful. All while knowing she had signed the very document that drove Vanessa to light the match. They were not innocent bystanders swept up in Vanessa's chaos. They were the silent accomplices who funded it. I created a new folder on my desktop. I named it Accomplices. I dragged the PDF inside. The narrative my parents sold to the world was that they were just trying to keep the peace. I looked at the digital file. This was not peace. This was financial treason. I picked up my phone. Corey called me just before noon. His voice was tight, stripped of its usual professional distance. He asked if I was sitting down. I told him I was standing in my temporary office, reviewing inventory lists. He asked me to confirm the contents of the north wall of my studio. Specifically, the items stored in the climate-controlled glass case near the window. I pulled up my master inventory spreadsheet. I read off the items. A set of 19th century brass sconces, a damaged mahogany writing desk, and a rolled canvas, an 18th century pastoral landscape. Corey stopped me there. He asked who owned the landscape. I explained the logistics of art restoration. The landscape did not belong to me, nor did it belong to the Oakwood estate. It was a consigned piece from the Savannah Historical Arts Foundation. They had hired me to remove decades of nicotine stains and degraded varnish. The painting was insured for a significant sum. Corey went quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted into official law enforcement territory. By targeting that specific room, Vanessa had not just destroyed my personal property. She had incinerated a historically significant artifact belonging to a third-party institutional fund. The local fire department was no longer just looking at a dispute over family paperwork. The destruction of consigned foundation property crossed a very clear legal line. The stakes had just escalated from civil family court to potential federal liability. Vanessa thought she was surgical. She thought she was burning a single filing cabinet full of legal threats. She did not know what was sitting 5 feet away in the glass case. She had no idea how to appraise value beyond a real estate listing. Her ignorance was about to cost her everything. I opened the foundation's contract on my laptop. I had the signed intake forms, the condition reports, and the high-resolution photographs taken the day the painting arrived. Every piece of documentation proved the painting was in the building at the time of the fire. Corey asked if I was willing to hand those records over to the police immediately. I told him I had already compiled them into a secure file transfer. I hit the send button while we were still on the phone. The progress bar filled the screen, green and steady. Vanessa wanted to play a game of destruction. She was about to learn that destroying things has a price tag she could not afford. I thanked Corey and hung up the phone. I looked at the sent confirmation receipt on my screen. The trap was closing. 2 days later, the insurance adjuster arrived at the temporary office. Her name was Diane. She set a thick manila folder on my desk and did not offer a handshake. She looked at the inventory list I had submitted, then looked at me with a tight, skeptical expression. She said the claim was being placed on administrative hold. I asked her why. Diane shifted her weight and explained that the company had received an anonymous email the morning after the fire. The email detailed a very specific narrative. It claimed my restoration business was failing, that I was drowning in hidden operational debt, and that I had intentionally sparked the fire to collect the insurance payout. I did not raise my voice. I did not act insulted. I simply asked Diane if the anonymous sender had provided any financial records to back up the claim. She admitted they had not. I opened my laptop and turned the screen toward her. I showed her my business accounts, my tax returns for the past 5 years, and the steady stream of high-value client deposits. The numbers were plain and healthy. I told Diane that people who are failing financially usually have a paper trail of unpaid bills. I had none. Diane looked at the screen. The skepticism in her eyes began to waver, replaced by professional confusion. That afternoon, I called Corey. I told him about the insurance hold and the anonymous tip. He went quiet, the kind of quiet that means an investigator is putting 2 pieces of a puzzle together. He asked me to forward the email header information Diane had shared with me. It took Corey less than 4 hours to trace the digital footprint. He called me back just as the sun was setting. The email had been routed through a public wireless network to mask the sender's identity. But people who think they are clever usually overlook the physical geography of their actions. The IP address traced back to a small, independent coffee shop on the north side of the city. Corey read the address of the coffee shop aloud over the phone. It was right next door to Vanessa's real estate office. Vanessa had not just tried to destroy my legal leverage. She had tried to frame me for arson. She wanted to lock me in a defensive battle with an insurance company, draining my time and resources so I would not focus on Oakwood. She wanted to turn me into a suspect. It was a calculated, dirty move. It was also a mistake. By sending that email, she had documented her own malice. She had given the fire investigator another thread to pull, one that connected her office directly to the timeline of the crime. I wrote the coffee shop address down in my ledger. I thanked Corey and ended the call. The room was very quiet. I turned off the desk lamp. I locked the door. The anonymous email proved Vanessa was desperate to keep me distracted. I needed to know exactly what was driving her timeline. Why burn the studio now? Why not wait until Gloria's estate officially entered the standard probate process? I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black tea and a stack of public property records. Vanessa was a real estate agent. She left a paper trail every time she made a deal. I started cross-referencing her recent closed sales with the holding companies operating in our county. The pattern emerged slowly. For the last 6 months, Vanessa had not closed a single residential property. Her income stream had dried up. Yet, she was still making minimum payments on her luxury lease and keeping her office doors open. The money had to be coming from somewhere. I dug deeper into the commercial zoning requests near the Oakwood estate. 3 weeks ago, a commercial developer out of Atlanta had submitted a preliminary inquiry for rezoning a large parcel of historical land. They wanted to build a luxury wellness resort. The parcel they requested included the exact acreage of Oakwood. I pulled the developer's corporate filings. I cross-matched their vendor payouts with Vanessa's registered LLC. There it was, a line item for consulting services. They had paid Vanessa a non-refundable advance of $50,000. She had sold them a promise. She guaranteed the developer that Oakwood would be cleared of its historical restrictions and ready for sale by the end of the quarter. If she failed to deliver the land, she would owe them the advance, plus aggressive penalty fees she could never afford to pay. Vanessa was not just fighting for a share of an inheritance. She was fighting to cover up a fraudulent transaction. She had taken money for an asset she did not own, operating under the assumption that Cynthia and Douglas would help her break Gloria's trust. When she realized I held the original documents, panic set in. The fire was her blunt force solution to a complex financial trap. I printed the vendor payout record. I printed the zoning inquiry. I stacked them neatly next to the forged loan guarantee my parents had signed. Every page told the same story. My family viewed Oakwood as a bank vault, and they viewed me as the broken lock they needed to smash. I looked at the $50,000 figure. Vanessa had sold out our grandmother's legacy for the price of 6 months of leased cars and expensive dinners. I filed the papers into the red binder. I closed the folder. I was ready. Vanessa rarely visited my side of town. She hated the smell of the chemical solvents in my studio, and she hated the dust. For her to know exactly which filing cabinet held my important papers, and for her to know about the false document index I had left on the desk. She needed an inside source. I thought about the last 3 weeks at the studio. I worked alone mostly. The only other person who had a key was a 22-year-old college student named Maya. I hired her part-time to help catalogue old inventory and sweep the floors. Maya was quiet, hard-working, and always stressed about her tuition bills. I found Maya sitting on a bench outside the campus library. She looked up from her textbook, her face draining of colour the moment she saw me. She knew about the fire. The local news had covered it. I sat down next to her. I did not yell. I did not accuse her of arson. I spoke in the same even tone I use when explaining a restoration process to a client. I told her the police knew the fire was intentional. I told her the investigator had a suspect, and that they were looking into anyone who had provided the suspect with the studio layout. Maya began to cry. She pulled her knees to her chest and stared at the concrete. She told me she met Vanessa at a coffee shop near the university. Vanessa introduced herself as my sister. She was wearing a designer coat and ordered an expensive latte. Vanessa told Maya she was worried about my mental health. She claimed I was hoarding family heirlooms and refusing to let my parents see them. Then Vanessa offered Maya a deal, $2,000 in cash, enough to cover the rest of her semester. All Maya had to do was take a few photographs of my office space, specifically the locks on the filing cabinets, and leave the side door unlocked on a Tuesday night. Maya swore she did not know about the fire. She thought it was just a family dispute over old furniture. She was desperate for the tuition money. Vanessa had identified the most vulnerable person in my orbit and bought her loyalty with pocket change. I handed Maya a tissue. I told her that cooperating with the fire investigator was her only path forward. If she told Corey exactly what Vanessa paid her to do, she would be treated as a witness, not an accomplice. If she lied, she would carry the weight of a federal felony. Maya nodded, her hands shaking. She agreed to talk to Corey. I walked back to my car. My sister had stalked my life, compromised my employee, and plotted the destruction of my business. It was clinical. I started the engine. The drive home was quiet. The silence from my end must have terrified Vanessa. When a bully strikes and the victim does not immediately react, the bully assumes they missed the target. Vanessa decided to change her weapon. If fire did not work, she would use the audience. On a Tuesday morning, my phone began to buzz with notifications. Relatives I had not spoken to in years were suddenly sending me messages. A few clients emailed, asking if everything was okay. I opened the local community social media board. Vanessa had posted a video. She was sitting in her pristine living room, wearing a simple, understated sweater. The lighting was soft. She looked straight into the camera, her eyes perfectly glassy. She spoke about the tragic fire at my studio, offering her public prayers for my recovery. Then, the tone shifted. She told the camera that the fire had complicated a sensitive family matter. She claimed our grandmother had left Oakwood to the entire family to be a shared gathering place for future generations. But, she said, her younger sister me had found a legal loophole to seize control of the land. She painted me as cold and calculating. She said I was preparing to evict our elderly parents and sell the family heritage to the highest bidder. It was a masterclass in manipulation. She took every single thing she was guilty of and projected it onto me. Cynthia was the first to comment on the video. A mother's heart breaks when greed tears her daughters apart. We just want our family home safe. Douglas added a praying hands emoji. Dozens of community members chimed in, offering sympathy to Vanessa and expressing outrage at my supposed cruelty. 10 years ago, a video like this would have broken me. I would have spent hours drafting a long, emotional response, begging the extended family to believe me. I would have called Cynthia, crying, asking how she could participate in such a lie. I did none of those things. I watched the video a second time, noting the specific phrasing she used to describe the estate. I took screenshots of her claims. I captured Cynthia's comment. Gossip is only powerful if you fear the dark. I was preparing to turn on every light in the building. Let them build their audience. Let them gather the crowd. They thought they were shaping the narrative. They were actually just ensuring that when the truth dropped, everyone would be watching. I saved the video file to the red binder folder. I did not type a single word in defense. I closed the browser. I went back to work. The social media video was noise. The document I found that afternoon was the signal, while verifying the commercial zoning permits. I pulled the draft purchase agreement the Atlanta developer had filed with the county clerk. It was a preliminary term sheet, outlining the conditions of the sale once Vanessa secured the title to Oakwood. I read through the land survey details, the environmental waivers, and the payment schedules. Then I reached Section 4, the property transfer conditions. Oakwood sat on 14 acres. The main house was near the centre, but the south acre backed up against a newly developed commercial strip. That south acre was highly valuable. It was also where Harold's cottage stood. I read the clause. It was written in sterile, transactional ink. Seller agrees that the secondary structure located on the south parcel shall be delivered vacant. Current occupant to be removed before closing. Buyer assumes no liability for relocation. Vanessa was not just selling the land. She was actively orchestrating Harold's eviction. He had lived in that cottage for 40 years. He knew the soil, the trees, and the history of my grandmother's life better than anyone. He was 72 years old, living on a modest fixed income. Vanessa intended to throw him out onto the street just to finalize her payout. If you have ever had to stand up to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves against the people you share blood with, comment, documented, and keep listening. I looked at the draft agreement. My parents knew about this sale. Cynthia and Douglas had signed the guarantee. They knew Harold would be discarded like an old piece of furniture. They sanctioned it. The anger I felt was not the hot, blinding rage of betrayal. It was a cold, precise clarity. Up until this moment, the fight had been about my business and my inheritance. It had been about holding a boundary against a toxic family. But reading that clause changed the nature of the war. It was no longer just about defending my rights. It was about protecting a vulnerable man from a family that viewed human beings as disposable assets. Gloria had trusted me to protect the estate. But more importantly, she had trusted me to protect the people within it. I printed the term sheet. I highlighted Section 4 in bright yellow marker. I added it to the stack of evidence on my desk. The forged loan, the anonymous insurance tip, the purchased temp worker, the eviction clause. The paperwork was complete. The justification was absolute. It was time to invite them to the table. I picked up the phone and dialed my lawyer. My lawyer's name was Arthur. He operated out of a modest brick building downtown, far away from the glass-walled corporate firms Vanessa preferred to hire. Arthur did not wear expensive watches. He wore tweed jackets and possessed an encyclopedic memory of Georgia property law. When I walked into his office that afternoon, he already had the Oakwood file sitting on his desk. I handed him the titanium USB drive I had pulled from the ashes of my studio. He plugged it into his secure terminal and entered the decryption key. The screen populated with hundreds of scanned PDFs. To the average person, estate law is a maze of confusing terminology. Vanessa certainly thought so. She believed that whoever held the physical deed controlled the property. She assumed a standard last will and testament was the only hurdle between her and a massive payday. She did not understand what Gloria and Arthur had built 3 years ago. Arthur opened the primary folder. He turned the monitor so I could read the bold heading. It was the irrevocable living trust. A standard will is merely a set of instructions given to a probate judge. It can be contested. It can be stalled by angry relatives claiming undue influence or mental decline. But an irrevocable trust is different. It is an independent legal entity. When Gloria signed those papers, she legally transferred the ownership of Oakwood out of her personal name and into the trust. She stopped owning the estate while she was still breathing. By the time Gloria passed away, there was nothing left in her personal name for Vanessa to claim. The trust owned the house. The trust owned the land. And I was the sole named trustee. Fire can destroy paper, Arthur said, tapping his pen against the desk. But fire cannot destroy a legal structure registered across 3 different county databases and secured by a fiduciary. Vanessa had burned my business to the ground to destroy a threat that did not live in a filing cabinet. She had committed a federal crime to erase a boundary she could not actually touch. I looked at the digital signatures on the screen. Harold's name was there, right next to Gloria's. The gardener had witnessed the exact moment the fortress doors locked. I asked Arthur how quickly we could assemble the physical binders. I wanted every piece of paper perfectly bound. I wanted the forged loan guarantee, the commercial zoning inquiry, and the fire investigator's preliminary report, tabbed and indexed. Arthur adjusted his glasses. He said the binders would be ready by tomorrow morning. He did not ask if I wanted to negotiate a settlement with my family. He had known Gloria for decades. He knew exactly what she intended for Oakwood. And he knew I was not going to flinch. I signed a few routine authorization forms. The air in the office felt calm. I walked out into the sunlight. The trust was a solid shield, but I needed a sword. Vanessa's entire plan hinged on her ability to sell the South Acre to the commercial developer. She needed to deliver the land vacant and ready for bulldozers. If she could not deliver the land, she defaulted on her $50,000 advance. I drove from Arthur's office to the County Historical Society. The archivist, an older woman named Helen, smiled when she saw me. She walked over to the counter and handed me a thick, sealed envelope. It had arrived in the mail 2 days before the fire. 2 years ago, I started compiling the architectural history of Oakwood. I spent weekends photographing the original heart pine floors, documenting the antebellum brickwork, and tracing the genealogy of the property back to its foundations. Cynthia used to mock me for it. She said I was wasting my weekends playing museum curator when I should be out networking. I wasn't playing curator. I was building a barricade. I submitted that extensive research to the State Historical Commission. The envelope Helen handed me contained the final, official certification. Oakwood was now formally registered as a historic cultural property. I sat in my car and read the terms of the designation. The restrictions were rigid. The facade of the main house could not be altered. The original outbuildings, including Harold's cottage, were protected structures. And, most importantly, the 14 acres could not be subdivided for commercial development. Vanessa's buyer wanted to build a luxury wellness resort. They needed to clear the trees, demolish the cottage, and pour concrete over the south acre. The historical designation made that illegal, even if Vanessa somehow managed to break the trust. Even if she hired a dozen lawyers to drag me through court and miraculously won the deed, the land was now useless to her investors. She had promised her wealthy client a blank canvas. I had just turned it into a federally protected monument. I placed the historical certification into my briefcase next to the trust documents. I felt a quiet satisfaction. Vanessa viewed real estate merely as dirt and profit margins. She never bothered to look closer at the history beneath her expensive shoes. Her lack of curiosity was her fatal flaw. I started the engine. The puzzle was complete. Every exit door Vanessa could possibly use was now bolted shut and welded from the outside. The legal trap, the historical trap, and the financial trap were all aligned. I drove back to my temporary apartment to draft a text message. It was time to invite the wolves inside the house. I parked the car. I sat on the edge of my bed and opened the group chat with Cynthia and Vanessa. I had not sent a message in this thread since the night of the fire. I kept my wording brief, neutral, and intentionally vague. We need to resolve the estate and discuss the future of Oakwood. I will be at the main house tomorrow at 2. Bring your lawyer. The response was almost immediate. The typing bubble appeared under Cynthia's name for a few seconds before her message popped up. Of course, Caroline. We just want what is fair for the family. See you tomorrow. I stared at the screen. The polite, measured tone was predictable. In their minds, my invitation was a white flag. They assumed the fire had broken my resolve. They believed I was sitting in a cheap rental, terrified of a prolonged legal battle, ready to sign away Gloria's legacy just to make the tension stop. I placed my phone face down on the nightstand. The next morning, I arrived at Oakwood 2 hours early. The air was crisp, and the ancient oak trees cast long, quiet shadows over the driveway. I unlocked the heavy mahogany front door and stepped into the foyer. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. Harold was in the kitchen, brewing coffee. I walked in and poured myself a cup. I did not tell him the specifics of the ambush I had planned, but I told him he did not need to worry about packing his belongings. He gave me a slow nod, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He wiped down the counter and went back out to the garden. At 1:30, Arthur arrived. He carried a heavy leather briefcase. We walked into the formal dining room and arranged the seating. I took the chair at the head of the long oak table. Arthur sat to my right. We placed 3 thick red binders on the polished wood, one for Cynthia and Douglas, one for Vanessa, one for her lawyer. The binders contained the trust, the historical certification, the commercial zoning inquiry, the arson investigator's preliminary report, and the forged loan guarantee. We are about to walk into the storm. If you are ready to see exactly how an empire of lies falls apart in complete silence, subscribe right now. At exactly 2 o'clock, the crunch of gravel echoed from the driveway. I looked out the bay window, Vanessa's leased SUV parked near the front steps. My parents pulled in right behind her. They walked up the porch steps, talking quietly among themselves. I could hear the faint click of Vanessa's designer heels. I smoothed the cover of the first red binder. The doorbell rang. I let Arthur open the door. I remained seated at the head of the dining table, my hands resting lightly on the polished wood. Vanessa walked into the room first. She wore a sharp-tailored suit, carrying herself with the posture of a woman arriving to collect a prize. Her lawyer, a man with a slicked-back hairline and a very expensive briefcase, trailed closely behind her. Cynthia and Douglas entered last. My father avoided my gaze, looking at the floorboards. Cynthia offered me a sympathetic, condescending smile. "Caroline," Cynthia said, taking a seat near the middle of the table, "I'm glad you finally decided to be reasonable. This fighting is so exhausting." I did not reply. I gestured toward the empty chairs. Vanessa sat down across from me, crossing her legs. She looked at the red binders, but did not reach for them. Instead, she slid a single sheet of paper across the long table toward me. "We want to make this easy for you," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "I know losing your studio was hard. My investors are willing to offer you a $50,000 settlement from the initial sale of the South Acre. You sign over your claim to Oakwood, and you walk away with enough cash to rent a new workspace." I looked at the piece of paper. It was an insult wrapped in a legal header. $50,000 to abandon an $850,000 estate and allow an old man to be evicted. "The land will be cleared by the end of next month," Vanessa's lawyer added, folding his hands. "It's a very generous offer, considering the original will was unfortunately lost." They actually believed the narrative they had constructed. They were sitting in a house they did not own, negotiating with money they did not have, trying to buy my compliance with pocket change. I looked at Douglas. "You agree with this?" "Dad," Douglas shifted uncomfortably. "It's for the best. Caroline, we have to look out for the whole family." I pushed Vanessa's settlement offer back across the table. It slid until it bumped against her coffee cup. "I am not here to negotiate a real estate transaction," I said. My voice was low, flat, and echoed slightly in the large room. "I am here to inform you of your new reality." Vanessa scoffed, a short, sharp sound. "Don't be dramatic, Caroline. You don't have the deed. You don't have leverage." I unclasped the latch on the red binder in front of me. I flipped it open to the first tab. I looked at Vanessa. "Open the binder." Vanessa did not touch the binder. She leaned back in her chair, radiating impatience. Her lawyer, however, reached out and flipped open the red cover. His eyes scanned the first page. I watched his posture change. The professional arrogance drained from his shoulders in less than 10 seconds. "Tab 1, I said, my voice steady. "The preliminary fire investigators report. The origin point was deliberate. The accelerant was chemical. And the IP address used to send a fraudulent insurance tip traces back to a public network directly adjacent to your office." Vanessa's confident smile froze. "That proves nothing. You can't accuse me of—" "I don't have to accuse you," I interrupted, cutting through her defense smoothly. "Corey already spoke to Maya. Your $2,000 bribe was poorly hidden. She handed over the text messages you sent her, coordinating the layout of my studio." Cynthia gasped softly. She turned to look at Vanessa. Douglas gripped the edge of the table. "You burned a building," I continued, "because you believed the original deed to this house was sitting in the third drawer of a metal cabinet. You read the index I left on the desk, and you took the bait." The room was painfully quiet. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The files you burned were decoys. Vanessa, useless, outdated tax forms. I tapped the edge of the open binder. You risked 20 years in federal prison to incinerate blank paper. Vanessa swallowed hard. The colour had completely vanished from her face. She looked at her lawyer, silently pleading for him to fix the narrative. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. Even if these allegations of arson are pursued, it does not change the probate status of this estate. Without a verified will, the property enters standard division. He was still clinging to the illusion that this was a traditional inheritance dispute. He still thought the battlefield was flat. I looked at Cynthia. She was staring at Vanessa with a mixture of horror and calculation. She was trying to figure out how to distance herself from a criminal charge. "Turn to tab 2, I said to the lawyer. He flipped the heavy pages. "This is not a probate discussion." I stated. I let the silence stretch for 3 seconds to ensure every word landed. Gloria did not own Oakwood when she died. Vanessa stared at me. The lawyer stared at the document under tab 2. His finger traced the bold heading at the top of the page. It was the original, irrevocable, living trust, complete with the state seal and the fiduciary confirmation. I watched his eyes dart back and forth across the legal text. He was looking for a loophole, a missing signature, or a clerical error. He found nothing. 3 years ago, I said, keeping my tone conversational. Gloria recognized the financial risk Vanessa posed to this estate. She legally transferred the title of Oakwood into an independent trust. She stopped owning this house while she was still alive. It was never part of her probate estate. You cannot divide an asset that does not exist in the ledger. Vanessa leaned forward, her composure cracking. She snatched the binder from her lawyer and stared at the paper. The legal jargon meant nothing to her, but the signatures at the bottom were clear. Gloria's elegant script, my name as the sole trustee, and Harold's signature as the primary witness. "This is garbage," Vanessa snapped. "She wouldn't do this. You tricked her into signing this behind our backs." I did not argue with her. I instructed her to turn to tab 3. Under tab 3 was the formal certification from the State Historical Commission. I explained that even if Vanessa somehow managed to break an ironclad trust, the land was now federally recognized as a historic cultural property. Your commercial developer cannot clear the trees, I told her quietly. They cannot demolish Harold's cottage, and they cannot pour concrete over the South Acre to build a wellness resort. The land is legally restricted. Your $50,000 advance is a liability you cannot fulfill. Douglas finally looked up from the floor. The mention of the commercial developer made his face turn the color of ash. He knew about the advance. He knew the money was already gone. Cynthia touched her throat, her heavy gold bracelet clinking against her collarbone. I was not finished. I told Vanessa to look at the plastic sleeve tucked into the back folder pocket. It was the letter Gloria had written 6 months before her death. The one detailing the massive cash transfer meant to save Vanessa from her private lenders. I read the final line aloud. "I am not cutting you off from my love. Vanessa, I am cutting you off from the ability to destroy everything else I have built. You had your chance. You spent it." Vanessa stared at the handwriting. The narrative she had sold to the community, the story of the cruel grandmother and the greedy younger sister, evaporated in the sterile air of the dining room. She had been given a fortune. She had spent it on a leased Mercedes and hotel parties. She had no defense left, no excuses. I sat perfectly still, waiting for the reality of her financial ruin to settle over the table. Vanessa looked at her lawyer. Her panic morphed into a cold, desperate calculation. The silence in the dining room felt heavy. I expected Vanessa to stand up and walk out. I expected Douglas to finally intervene. Instead, Vanessa took a slow, steady breath and offered a thin smirk. She nodded at her lawyer. The lawyer closed the red binder. He reached into his own leather briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it onto the center of the oak table. A trust is only valid if the grantor possesses the legal capacity to execute it, he said, his professional confidence returning. We anticipated you might try to produce a document like this, Caroline, which is why we requested a review of Gloria's medical history. He tapped the paper. It was a medical evaluation form bearing the letterhead of a prominent Atlanta neurology clinic. The date at the top matched the exact month Gloria had signed the trust. This is a certified diagnostic report, the lawyer continued. It confirms that during the period the trust was established, Gloria was suffering from advanced cognitive decline, dementia. By law, she lacked the mental capacity to understand complex financial transfers. Therefore, the trust is void. I looked at the piece of paper. Vanessa had purchased a lie. Cynthia exhaled a sharp breath of relief. She sat up straighter, her posture shifting from fear back to her usual superiority. She looked across the table at me. You really tried, Caroline, Cynthia said softly. You went through all this effort to hide paper and build these little traps. But you forgot one thing. Family always wins. We are going to nullify that trust, and we are going to sell the estate just like we planned. Vanessa folded her hands on the table. My lawyer will file an emergency injunction tomorrow morning, she said. Your authority as trustee will be frozen. The commercial sale will proceed through probate court, and Harold will be served his eviction notice by Friday. You played a good game, but it's over. It was a brilliant counterattack. It relied on the assumption that a dead woman could not testify to her own sanity. They believed the medical certificate was an absolute checkmate. They thought my quiet demeanor meant I had finally run out of moves. I looked at the diagnostic report. I looked at Cynthia's smug expression and Vanessa's victorious smile. They were enjoying their 15 minutes of triumph. They were bathing in the illusion of control. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to defend my grandmother's memory. I simply reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out a small, black remote control. I aimed it at the large flat-screen television mounted above the fireplace mantel. You should look at the screen, I said. The television clicked on. The screen flickered, then resolved into a bright, high-definition video. It was recorded in Gloria's study 3 years ago. Gloria sat in her leather wingback chair. She wore a tailored blouse, her hair perfectly styled. Her eyes were sharp, bright, and completely lucid. Standing on her left was Arthur. Standing on her right were 2 individuals wearing medical badges. My name is Gloria Oakwood, she said clearly into the camera. Today, I am executing an irrevocable living trust. Beside me are Dr. Eris and Dr. Lynn, independent specialists who have just concluded a comprehensive cognitive evaluation. They will testify that I am of sound mind, fully aware of my assets, and acting without coercion." Vanessa stopped smiling. Her lawyer sat rigid, staring at the screen. Gloria looked directly into the lens. "I am intentionally excluding my granddaughter, Vanessa, from the management of this estate. I am doing this because she has repeatedly engaged in fraudulent borrowing using the family name. I will not allow my legacy to be liquidated to cover her reckless debts." The video kept playing, showing Gloria reading the core terms of the trust aloud, her voice unwavering. I pressed pause. The dining room was dead silent. I picked up the medical evaluation form Vanessa's lawyer had placed on the table. I slid it back toward him. "Your medical certificate is a forgery," I told him quietly. "If you look closely at the physician's signature on the bottom right, you will notice a slight pixelation along the curve of the ink. It is not an original signature. It is a digital scan, cropped and dragged from a routine blood work file dated 5 years ago." I leaned forward slightly. "Vanessa did not just burn my studio to hide her debt. She handed you a fabricated legal document to present in a dispute over an $850,000 estate. That is a felony." The lawyer looked at the paper. He looked at the paused video on the screen. The realization hit him like physical force. Vanessa had lied to him. She had used his firm to facilitate fraud. He did not say a word to Vanessa. He stood up, shoved the fake medical certificate into his briefcase, and snapped the locks shut. "I am withdrawing as your counsel," he said to Vanessa, his voice clipped and cold. "Do not contact my office again." He walked out of the dining room. The front door opened and closed. Vanessa was sitting alone at the table. Her mother was staring at her, finally seeing the reality of the situation. The false victory was over. The paperwork was verified. I checked my watch, right on time. Through the bay window of the dining room, the afternoon light shifted. A silent wash of red and blue flashed across the formal lawn. 2 police cruisers parked directly behind Vanessa's leased SUV, blocking it in. Cynthia stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. She walked to the window, her hands trembling as she pulled back the sheer curtain. Douglas remained seated, staring blankly at his empty coffee cup. He had spent his entire life avoiding conflict, and now the conflict had parked in his driveway. Corey stepped out of the lead cruiser. He was accompanied by 2 uniformed officers. They walked up the porch steps with measured, deliberate strides. "Caroline," Cynthia whispered, turning toward me. Her voice was thin, stripped of all its previous arrogance. "What did you do?" "I did exactly what you told me to do on the night of the fire," I replied, keeping my hands resting on the table. "I took care of it." The heavy mahogany front door was still unlocked from the lawyer's departure. Corey entered the foyer and stepped into the dining room. He held a thick folder in his left hand. He looked at Vanessa. She was frozen in her chair, her manicured nails digging into the edge of the oak table. "Vanessa," Corey said, his tone professional and absolute. "We have a warrant for your arrest." He read off the charges. "Aggravated arson for the destruction of my studio. Insurance fraud for the anonymous email attempting to frame me. And wire fraud, related to the forged loan documents and the undisclosed consulting fees from the commercial developer." An officer stepped forward and asked Vanessa to stand. She did not resist. The reality of the metal handcuffs clicking around her wrists shattered the illusion she had spent years building. She looked at Cynthia. "Mom!" Vanessa cried, her voice cracking into a high, desperate pitch. Tell them I didn't mean to do it. Tell them it's a mistake. Cynthia lunged forward, grabbing my arm. Caroline, please, you have the papers. You won the house. Just tell them to drop the charges. We can fix this quietly. We are a family. I looked at my mother's hand on my sleeve. I reached over and gently removed it. You signed the loan guarantee that funded this, I told her quietly. You knew she was drowning, and you pointed her toward my business to save your own reputation. You do not get to ask for quiet now. Corey nodded to the officers. They escorted Vanessa out of the dining room. The front door shut. The flashing lights faded down the driveway. I sat at the head of the table. 3 weeks after Vanessa's arrest, the financial dominoes finally fell. The private equity firm in Atlanta did not care that my sister was sitting in a county jail cell awaiting trial. They cared about their money. When Vanessa defaulted on the loans, the lenders immediately executed the guarantee document. They bypassed Vanessa and went straight for the co-signers. Cynthia and Douglas had pledged their own assets to back a fraudulent real estate deal. The bank seized their retirement accounts. The private lenders placed a heavy lien on their suburban house. Within a month, the quiet, comfortable facade my parents had spent their entire lives building evaporated. They lost their country club membership. They lost their leased cars. They were facing personal bankruptcy. I was reviewing a contractor's bid for the studio rebuild when the intercom at the front gate buzzed. I looked at the security monitor. A faded 10-year-old sedan was idling on the gravel. Douglas was behind the wheel. Cynthia sat in the passenger seat. I pressed the button to open the gates, but I did not invite them up to the main house. I walked down the long driveway to meet them near the oak trees. Cynthia stepped out of the car. She looked smaller. The heavy gold jewelry was gone. Her posture, usually so rigid and commanding, was slumped. She offered a trembling, uneven smile. Douglas stood by the car door, refusing to meet my eyes. Caroline, Cynthia said, stepping forward. We needed to see you. Things have been very difficult. I stopped 10 feet away. I did not cross my arms. I simply waited. We are losing the house, she continued, her voice wavering. The lawyers say there is nothing we can do. We hoped we could stay in the guest wing at Oakwood, just for a few months, just until we get back on our feet and figure out how to heal from all of this. She used the word heal. She framed their financial ruin as a shared family tragedy, hoping I would play the role of the dutiful daughter and offer them shelter. I looked at Douglas. He shifted his weight, studying the gravel. You did not come here to heal, I said. My voice was level, carrying clearly in the crisp afternoon air. You came here because you ran out of money to cover up a crime you helped commit. Cynthia flinched. We are your parents, Caroline. You have this massive estate. You have plenty of room. You can't just turn your back on family. I am not turning my back. I replied, I am enforcing a boundary. You signed a document giving my sister permission to sell land out from under a vulnerable old man. You endorsed her fraud. You cannot burn down my livelihood and then ask to sleep in my guest room. Cynthia started to cry. It was the first time I had ever seen her shed real tears. We have nowhere else to go. Please. I looked at them. The anger was gone, replaced by a quiet, immovable certainty. I am not closing the door on my parents, I told her. I am just locking the door you used to walk into my life whenever you needed something. The guest wing is not available." I turned around. I walked back up the driveway. I locked the iron gate. 1 year later, the scent of smoke was completely gone from the property. In its place was the sharp, clean smell of linseed oil, sanded oak, and blooming roses. I did not sell oak wood. I used a portion of the estate's liquid assets to rebuild my restoration studio on the exact footprint of the old one. But I expanded the design. I added 4 long workbenches, a ventilation system, and a dedicated classroom space. Oakwood was no longer just a private residence. It was a registered vocational training centre. I partnered with a local foundation to offer apprenticeships to young women transitioning out of the foster care system. They came to the estate to learn a trade. They learned how to mix solvents, how to repair damaged canvas, and how to assess the structural integrity of antique wood. More importantly, they learned how to build something permanent for themselves. I walked through the studio on a Tuesday morning. 3 apprentices were bent over a large Victorian dining table, carefully stripping away layers of cheap modern paint to reveal the original mahogany grain underneath. They were focused, quiet, and deliberate. Outside the large bay windows, the South Acre remained untouched by bulldozers. The commercial developer had quietly withdrawn their zoning inquiry the moment the Historic Cultural Property certification was filed. The threat of a luxury resort was dead. Harold was in the garden. He was wearing his usual denim overalls, tying up a row of climbing vines along the brick wall. When the legal dust settled, Arthur and I drafted a new document. We granted Harold a formal life estate. It meant he had the absolute legal right to live in the caretaker's cottage for the rest of his life. Rent-free, protected by the trust. No one could ever threaten him with an eviction notice again. He waved at me through the glass. I raised my coffee mug in return. Vanessa's trial did not last long. Faced with the forged loan signatures, the IP address from the coffee shop, and Maya's testimony, her defense crumbled. She took a plea deal. She is currently serving her sentence in a state facility. Cynthia and Douglas moved into a small apartment in a neighbouring county. I receive a card from them once a year on my birthday. I read them, but I do not reply. Gloria knew exactly what she was doing when she handed me the keys. She knew the house needed a guardian, but she also knew I needed a fortress. She gave me the tools to stop shrinking by protecting Oakwood. I had finally learned how to protect myself. I walked out to the porch. The air was warm. The roses were blooming. There is a specific kind of quiet that arrives when you finally stop fighting for a place at a table where you were never respected. For 34 years, I thought peace meant avoiding conflict. I thought being the easy child, the quiet daughter, and the independent professional was the price of admission to my family. I was wrong. Peace built on your own silence is not peace. It is just a deferred payment plan for someone else's comfort. And eventually, the bill comes due. I sat at my desk in the new studio. The 18th century pastoral landscape painting from the Savannah Historical Arts Foundation rested on an easel in front of me. It had survived the fire inside its climate-controlled case. I had spent the last 2 months carefully removing the yellowed varnish. The original colours were vibrant again. The hidden details were visible. Restoration is a slow process. It requires you to look past the dirt and evaluate the actual structure beneath. You have to strip away the lies to see what is real. Fire operates the same way. It is destructive, but it is also a harsh illuminator. The fire in my studio proved exactly what my family was made of. It burned away the polite smiles, the country club manners, and the illusion of loyalty. What remained in the ashes was the truth. My sister was a thief, my parents were enablers, and I was the one holding the ledger. You do not have to raise your voice to win a war. You do not have to stoop to their level. Trade insults in a parking lot, or beg for validation from people who view you as a resource. You just have to document your reality. You secure your borders. You arrange the facts in a straight line, and you let those facts do the talking. If you are the one holding the line in your family, keep your receipts. Do not let them normalize their cruelty. Hold your peace, secure your boundaries, and share this story with a woman who needs to hear it. The people who underestimate a quiet woman always learn her value too late. Truth doesn't burn. Stay strong. I picked up my pen. The ledger stays open.